Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi al-Tahirin. We are on lesson 4 of Ilmul Akhlaq, or the science of morality or ethics. And today we are going to continue the topics of Akhlaq. And we talked about so far an introduction to the science of morality. We talked about the different methods of morality. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about, firstly, irfan and akhlaq. You have probably heard this term irfan, and you've heard this term akhlaq. So these are two important sciences to discuss. And here we want to talk about the relation between the relation and the difference. Here we want to talk about the difference between these two sciences. So when we consider the science of akhlaq, the science of ethics, as stated earlier, it is basically acquiring some beautiful qualities of the soul. We want to say, what is akhlaq? We want to describe akhlaq. Akhlaq is to teach us how to acquire, how to adorn ourselves with some of those beautiful qualities, with those beautiful qualities of the soul, and how to remove that junk, that rubbish, that garbage of vices, of ugly qualities from our soul. So the science of akhlaq is the science that teaches us how to develop virtues and remove vices. It is the science which teaches us how to develop virtues and how to remove vices. Therefore, one can randomly choose any virtue from the aspect or perspective of ilmu akhlaq, and one can start with any virtue to work on, any vice to remove from the perspective of akhlaq. So one can start with, as example, the virtue of courage, or generosity, or hilm, forbearance, or patience. And then they could work on removing impatience, condemnable anger, irascibility, we'll talk about later, miserliness. So one can then work on any one of these to remove the vices and develop virtues. Which means that over here in Ilmu Akhlaq, there is no set method for attainment of all virtues per se as a set. There's no specific set method that you must follow to be able to reach through all the morals and get rid of all the vices. You could start at certain ones, some more important than others, as you'll see in virtue ethics. Some are more important than others, and they have a very important role towards other vices, getting rid of them and developing other virtues. But one could start with any given virtue or vice if they want to. So here there is no set methodology in this sense to the attainment of all virtues per se in Ilmu Akhlaq, but rather there is a methodology for each virtue, of how to develop it, and which you can start at whichever virtue you want, and you can begin to self-develop into becoming a fully virtuous human being. So that's the first thing to note, that akhlaq is somehow giving room and flexibility to choose any virtue and start with. Also, akhlaq is having the aim of developing beautiful qualities, virtues, and removing vices. So to some perspectives, to some level, different people around the world may develop different virtues and remove different vices. Now, some of these virtues have to do with obedience to Allah, and use of intellect and things like that. But there are other virtues that maybe people can develop all around the world, and it won't. They could develop them, and they like being generous. A person could have a generous quality in them. As far as per the virtue itself, not the absolute perfect virtue as being in accordance with direction towards Allah the Exalted. So that's how akhlaq is. Akhlaq is like this, simply. Whereas irfan, spirituality, has a set methodology, and its aim is different. Although akhlaq is part of the spiritual journey of irfan, it is not the same thing. So irfan's methodology is different. It says you start from certain stages and stations we'll talk about. And its aim is different. Its aim is a realization of Allah the Exalted through those process of self-purification. You arrive at a awareness, a realization of Allah the Exalted. And there's discussion here when you get into irfan al-nazari, theoretical irfan. So anyways, so irfan or spirituality is divided into two major categories. When we talk about irfan is divided into two major categories. Irfan al-nazari, the theoretical irfan, you talk about things about Allah's existence and such. And irfan al-amali, practical irfan, how to reach to that realization of Allah, how to self-purify yourself, what stages and stations. So irfan has two branches. Irfan nazari, theoretical irfan al-amali, practical irfan. And over in practical irfan, you have different approaches to how to practically reach to the aim of irfan. The aim of irfan as well, we can say, is a realization of Allah the Exalted. The aim of doing this whole spiritual practical irfan and self-purification is not merely the adornment of the self-lived virtues, but it is to gain a realization of Allah the Exalted. And through that spiritual movement and self-purification that one is doing in this process of an irfanic journey, one obtains a realization. So you see, the aims could be said to be a bit different. Because the aim of akhlaq was to adorn oneself with virtues and remove vices. Whereas the aim of irfan is the realization of Allah the Exalted through a process of self-purification. Also, the methodology is different. You could pick any type of moral and start working from there. Whereas in irfan, there's a set type of practical method, which has differences amongst different irfanic trends. So also irfan has specific method to reach that aim. So that's that practical method. When we come to irfan al-amali has a specific method to reach the aim. However, scholars of irfan, they differ in the arrangement of some of the stages and stations, and whether some are stages and stations or not could happen. So in irfan, we have something called hal. Hal is a state. And we have another thing called maqam. Maqam is a station. So there are stages and stations. States are like temporal things, and stations are fixed places that you've arrived at. And you go through these fixed stations and until they become fixed stations, and then you arrive at the realization of Allah the Exalted, or you arrive at higher levels of irfan. Like one can have the state of tawbah until they reach a level where tawbah becomes a station for them. They're fixed in that station. Then they could have the states of self-accountability until they reach a level where self-accountability becomes a station. Or riyada, spiritual exercise. So in irfan, we have states and stations, hal and makam. States are a temporal kind of passing occurrence of a spiritual stations. When they become fixed, then one has reached that station. And hence they can move onward to the next station that's appropriate to them in this spiritual journey. And it's possible that some people have different stations they go at, or even maybe even some things can happen at the same time. It's possible. You have to, you have to look into these things if you want to know about them. So some scholars of irfan say the very first station, as example, that one would have is called the station of yaqza. Yaqza is waking up. That's where one wakes up from their ghafl, from their heedlessness. They wake up to the existence of Allah the Exalted. They wake up to their real situation. They wake up to where they are going. They wake up to realization of their state. So many people are in heedlessness. They're in ghafl. They're ghafil. Heedless of the presence of Allah. Heedless of where they are going. Heedless of their own condition. They're asleep, but they're walking. They're sleepwalking. They just need a little jolt to wake them up. And they wake up and they realize what situation they're in. They realize they have to move forward. This is the type of thing that happens in the stage of awakening. They wake up. Then after that, other stations would occur, and hal would occur. Temporal states will occur until one and so other stations that one will find amongst the irfanic path after that are tawbah, repentance, self-accountability, spiritual exercise, etc. So those kinds of things, the practical irfan, they deserve courses on their own and research on their own. This is not the topic of irfan. This is not the topic of Ilm al-Akhlaq. Ilm al-Akhlaq's topic is how to develop moral qualities and how to remove vices. So when we get to these types of things, this is another branch which is related to irfan. And as scholars, like I said, they call urafa. They differ in their arrangement of these stations and stages, and also there's discussions on certain types of practical methods, and maybe even some scholars what is an acceptable type and what is not, and these are all different types of discussions. So when you come to irfan, it's a topic itself. You could have history of irfan. You could have methodology of irfan. You could have practical irfan. You could have spirituality of other religions could be looked into, comparative spirituality. You could have theoretical irfan and discussions on theoretical irfan. So there's a lot of discussion that could be held when it comes to irfan. But the topic here is akhlaq, not irfan. So the two methods of irfan. Two things a person must do to assist them through on the irfanic journey. So two things a person must do to assist through ikhtiyar, through free will, in discovering the reality of the self, in discovering the goal of the arifin, the knowers, which is called a level of tajalli, witnessing through the soul, is takhali wa tahali. So this is a very important part of irfan. In irfan, you have two very important things, which are called takhali wa tahali. The first takhali, this is the removal of the waste and the rubbish of the self. This is that self-purification, the removal of the harmful vices and the residues remaining of an unruly nafs. Over here, you remove those barriers and obstacles that are in your way to spiritual progress and development, like the vices of arrogance, the vice of greed, the vice of impatience, and irascibility, condemnable anger. Some ulama, they mention that there are three main barriers to a person on their spiritual path. There are three main barriers. The first are vices, bad malaka. It's exactly this. It's a relation between irfan and akhlaq. You see, akhlaq comes into irfan. So the first barriers are our vices. The second are our sins. As sins, they are actually something that filthies up the soul. They contaminate the soul. And eventually they can lead to consequences of blinding of the heart. The third barrier on a spiritual path are specific habits and inclinations, like hubat dunya, love of the dunya, and other things. So this is the first essential thing in a irfanic journey, a spiritual path. It's takhali, to remove the rubbish of the self, to have self-purification. And there are barriers that prevent one from this spiritual journey, like vices, like sins, and bad habits and inclinations. The second important thing in irfan on a spiritual journey is called tahali. Tahali, this is technically beautification of the self. This is beautification of oneself, the adornment of one's soul. This is actually self-development. Here, some ulama, they mention it has two main parts. First part is that you establish over here virtues, like you establish forbearance, hilm, contentment, humility. So you see, this is a relation between akhlaq and irfan, development of virtues. The second part of tahali is the worship, the ibadat. Here, through worship, one gets closer to Allah the Exalted, and one builds themselves in the station of servitude. One builds himself in servitude to Allah the Exalted, in ubudiyah. So a real irfanic journey then crosses the paths with akhlaq and essentially adheres to the Islamic legislations and rules. So if you want to talk about a real irfanic journey, a real spiritual journey, it crosses paths with akhlaq. And it adheres to the Islamic legislation, the Islamic rules. This is very important, because some people have some strange ideas when it comes to spirituality. And spirituality, Islamic spirituality, a real authentic line of spirituality, is actually having Islam itself. A real spirituality is having the line of Islam itself. It's the authentic line of Islam itself. So following the authentic line of Islam itself within a spiritual path is part of that spiritual path. It can't be discarded. To illustrate the difference over here of these two studies of Ilm al-Akhlaq and Ilm al-Arfan, from the aspect of them being a practical science, you can imagine as if there is a very messy room. So imagine you have this very messy room cluttered with all sorts of garbage and filth. Over here, Ilm al-Akhlaq will direct us that we may begin anywhere in this room when cleaning it up. Yes, we have to clean it up, but we can begin anywhere in this room. If we want, we can go to the dishes, we can clean the floor, we can make the bed. It doesn't matter. The point in Ilm al-Akhlaq is cleaning up this room, not where one starts, metaphorically. Whereas in Irfan directs us that we must begin at a certain point. Hence, maybe we will have to begin at the desk, or by the door, or on the floor first. However, both intermingle though. Both intermingle. So this is just an example to get the point across. They both intermingle. As perhaps we can view Irfan as a prerequisite and a part of the initial and throughout the stages of a spiritual journey. So it's not something that is left. It's something that has to be present in the spiritual journey. So that is the difference between Irfan and Akhlaq. Now, we have the three-step method of how to know we are sick. So we have a three-step method. The first is diagnosis. We have diagnosis. Then we have the causes. Then we have the treatment. So we have diagnosis, causes, and treatment. So when we're faced with a specific illness of the soul, a vice, we have a three-step method: diagnosis, the causes, and the treatment. So let's briefly look at them. The first, diagnosis. Many times people are not aware they are sick. Many people don't know that they are ill. They don't know what their sickness actually is. Some of these common colds and the physical sickness that we have, we don't actually know what strain of sickness it is. What exactly is it? We're sitting around guessing. Is it the COVID? Is it this? Is it that? So same thing with spiritual sicknesses. Sometimes people are not even aware they're sick. They're walking around sick, but they don't realize it. They're sick, but they don't know what they have. Hence, they must be diagnosed. They must be diagnosed first, and then they realize that they are sick. Now, when we look at this issue of why a person is not realizing they are sick, there are several reasons that we can mention of why a person wouldn't realize that they are sick spiritually. The first is the nature of the vice itself. That is, sometimes certain vices can develop and grow over time in a person. Like if someone slowly commits immoral acts, over time it becomes a fixed quality in them to do those immoralities as a corresponding vice, which they did not realize they had. So because they commit those sins and those immoral acts, over time it turned into a fixed quality that they didn't realize that they developed. And now all of a sudden they have this illness in them. So that is one reason why people don't realize they are sick spiritually, because the nature of the vice itself. The second reason is sometimes we focus our attention on other people. Sometimes we're looking at other people and we actually don't introspect. Introspection, looking at the self, we don't look at ourselves. We don't look at ourselves, and we therefore pass over our own faults and prey on others' faults. So this is the second reason why a person may not realize they're sick. They're too busy looking at everybody else's faults instead of looking at themselves. They don't look into themselves instead. The third reason is sometimes people considered if no one tells me, if no one tells this person, if no one confronts him, then they must be fine. They don't have no vice. Nobody's saying I have a vice, so one must not have one. So I have no problems. Now, confronting a person, of course, has to be done within the moral and the religious obligations in a appropriate manner. So if no one tells this person that they're sick, then they think no problem. They must be perfectly fine. This assumption is wrong, though. It's a wrong induction, as other factors may be playing a role into why these people are not telling him, why he's not being addressed about it. Like maybe they're scared that they'll upset him, or they're worried to say something. So the first one is due to the nature itself. The third was sometimes we focus our attention on others instead of introspecting. The third is sometimes people consider if no one tells me, there's no problem. The fourth is sometimes people make excuses for themselves. And they try to find anything they can to justify and twist things in their favor. So they can say they are absolved and innocent. But in reality, they are not absolved, nor are they innocent. So they try to justify their wrongs. This is another reason why a person may not realize they're sick. They say, no, I wasn't doing this. I'm justifying. But their justification is incorrect. Their justification is not justified. The fifth is self-denial. It's another reason why people may not realize that they are sick inside is self-denial. Maybe here, when someone is told they have a problem, instead of addressing their problem and admitting it, they are in a state of self-denial. Over here, maybe when someone is told they have a problem, they reject it and they ignore it. They're in a state of self-denial, so they don't realize they're sick. No, I'm not sick. I don't have that vice. The last one is sometimes people will not admit they have a problem because they are arrogant. They have arrogance in them. They're not humble. So that they won't admit they're ill inside because they're too arrogant to say that they are sick and ill. So these are several reasons why a person may not realize that they're spiritually sick. The first was the nature of the vice itself. The second was that sometimes we focus our attention on others instead of introspecting. The third is sometimes people consider if no one tells them, then they are fine. The fourth is that sometimes people make excuses for themselves and they try to falsely justify themselves, but they're wrong. The fifth is self-denial. Sometimes people are in a state of self-denial. And the last one was sometimes people will not admit they have a problem because they are too arrogant to admit they have a problem. So diagnosis has three stages. First is to learn the symptoms of the vices. So you can diagnose it. You know the symptoms of the vices, then you can diagnose what the vice is. Each vice will have its own symptoms, just like sicknesses produce certain symptoms. So you could look at the symptoms according to knowledge about the vices, and you could try to determine which vice is there, which vice is present. The second stage is to ask trustworthy, honest believers. Trustworthy, honest believers. If you have a problem or a vice, be open to hearing them. Don't take offense. Honest, trustworthy believers, ask them, do I have a vice? And be open to really hearing it. A believer can be like a mirror for another believer. The third is imagine yourself in others' position. Imagine yourself in the place of others. Imagine what it would be like to be on the other side. If you could imagine what it's to be like on the other side, then maybe you'll realize that you have a vice. So this is the 3 stages of diagnosis. Learn the symptoms of the vices so you could diagnose it. Ask trustworthy and honest believers and be open to hearing them. And imagine yourself in the other's position and imagine yourself on the other side to see if you have a vice. So the second is the causes. Understanding the causes of the vices are useful in the treatment. If we know the causes, then we can address the issue better. Sometimes causes can be due to ignorance or misunderstanding. So sometimes because one is weak in iman, they're weak in faith. Sometimes it's because weak in will, weak in determination. Like they realize they're angry, but they think they are too weak to stop this anger. They're too weak to stop it. So you have to understand the causes of the vice. And this is useful in the treatment of the vice. If you know the causes, then you could address it better. The third level of treatment is the treatment stage. Here, the type of medicine or treatment of each vice will differ depending on how intense the vice actually is. Also, just like medicine that you use to treat physical illness, the treatment duration can differ as well. So the amount of time that you need to treat yourself may differ. And again, like medicine, there are various types of treatments which can be selected where prescription is right, or even when all are required for the treatment. So over here, you need knowledge, education of what is wrong and what is right, as well as the harms and the benefits of them. This is how you treat them, by knowing the wrong, the right, and the harms and the benefits. The benefits to the virtues, the harms to the vice. Sometimes the person may need to know these benefits of something. It may help a person to know the benefits to get over that vice and develop a virtue. Sometimes one may be required to be reminded of the weakness of the vice, the harms of the vice. The second thing is habitual action. You have to do repetitive action against that specific vice and in accordance with the given virtue until you develop a malaka. The third is building stronger iman, stronger faith. Here, knowledge and rituals are useful. So here, knowledge and rituals are useful. So you do ibadat and you gain ilm. The fourth is to soften your heart. To soften your heart, because some of the vices, they are hardening of the heart. They are heart hardening. So to soften it, like when seeing what the poor live like, that will soften the heart to be more compassionate, more generous, things like this. So soften the heart. So these are 4 things that help in the treatment stage: knowledge of what is right and wrong and the harms and the benefits, habitual action against a vice and in accordance with the virtue, building strong iman with knowledge and ibadat, and softening your heart for those vices that are hard-heartening, which are heart-hardening. That is everything for this lesson. Wa akhiru du'ana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.